There are stories buried deeper than bones, truths hidden beneath layers of dust, stone, and time. Some say history is written by the victors, but others know it's also rewritten by those afraid of what the past might reveal. This is a story about what was found and what was deliberately lost. Imagine standing beneath the great Sphinx of Giza, the desert wind swirling ancient sand around your feet. Tourists come and go, cameras flashing, but they don't see what lies beneath. In 1993, Japanese archaeologist Dr. Sakuji Yoshimura conducted a ground-penetrating radar survey near the monument's massive pause. What he discovered wasn't a hidden tomb or chamber. It was something no one could explain. A 30-meter metallic structure, symmetrical, engineered, and humming with energy. The object buried deep beneath the Sphinx wasn't made of stone or any known alloy. It defied categorization. It had chambers inside, patterns resembling circuitry, and its composition included isotopes that don't naturally exist on Earth. The metal didn't corrode, it pulsed. Somehow it was still active, its energy signatures aligned with mathematical constants that only the most advanced branches of quantum physics could describe. Yoshimura was stunned, and then, suddenly, he was silenced. Within 48 hours, his permits were revoked, his equipment seized, and he was escorted out of Egypt. But the data? He'd already sent it to Tokyo. Analysis by independent metallurgists confirmed the impossibility. Not only was the structure artificial, it was technologically superior to anything ancient or modern. That should have changed history. Instead, it disappeared from the narrative. The Egyptian government sealed the site. Satellite images showed newly poured concrete around the Sphinx, an effort to halt further investigation. Requests for academic access were denied. Journals refused to publish Yoshimura's findings, dismissing his data as lacking review. But behind the scenes, leaked documents revealed coordination between intelligence agencies. They weren't just interested, they were involved. One memo described the object as a threat to accepted historical timelines. Another recommended indefinite classification. The object remained undisturbed, but not inactive. It still emits signals, measurable and consistent, as if waiting for something or someone. What was it? A machine? A message? A relic of a forgotten civilization? Or something even older? These aren't the questions archaeologists are allowed to ask, because when the past contradicts the story we tell ourselves, the easiest solution is to bury it again. But this story isn't about conspiracies. It's about human nature, about how we fear the unknown more than we crave the truth. It's about how power protects its own narrative and how knowledge, real transformative knowledge, is sometimes the most dangerous artifact of all. The Sphinx machine wasn't just a discovery. It was a crack in the armor of our collective memory. And like all cracks, it reveals more than it hides. This is the beginning of a journey. Over the next 13 chapters, we'll travel across continents and centuries, from the deserts of South America to the ruins beneath Eastern Europe, uncovering stories of artifacts, civilizations, and individuals whose contributions were deemed too inconvenient to remember. These stories are real. The people existed. The discoveries were made. What followed wasn't always science. It was silence. And now we're listening again. What if human history isn't what we think it is? What if we've been here before, risen, fallen, and forgotten, more times than we've ever dared imagine? And what if the past isn't buried? What if it's waiting? Part 2 begins where the radar once echoed, beneath the stone gaze of a creature that has watched humanity forget itself again and again. The desert does not easily give up its secrets, but sometimes a quiet anomaly pierces the veil. In 1880, on the windswept plains of Argentina, geologist Dr. Carlos Ameghino made a discovery that should have rewritten everything we thought we knew about human origins. Instead, it vanished into the shadows of silence. Ameghino had been studying the Monte Hermoso Formation, a sedimentary layer dating back 25 million years. Among the fossilized flora and fauna, he uncovered something impossible: anatomically modern human remains. Not primitive hominids, not transitional species, but complete skeletons indistinguishable from people walking the streets today. The implications were staggering. According to accepted timelines, modern humans, Homo sapiens, emerged less than 300,000 years ago. But these remains were over 24 million years older. If true, it would mean our species either evolved far earlier than believed, or that an entirely different version of humanity had existed long before our recorded history. Ameghino documented his findings meticulously. Carbon dating, geological stratification, and independent peer reviews confirmed the authenticity of the remains. The fossils were embedded in rock layers untouched since the Miocene epoch, and yet within months his paper was retracted by the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute. The reasons? Sample contamination, misinterpretation of layers. But none of these explanations held up under scrutiny. Behind closed doors, academic institutions expressed concern. The discovery, they said, would create confusion and undermine the integrity of evolutionary science. But the truth lingered. British paleontologist Arthur Smith Woodward traveled to Argentina and confirmed Ameghino's conclusions. He even uncovered additional remains, along with tools and artifacts displaying signs of intentional craftsmanship. His reports, however, were quietly shelved. The British Museum never released them. Museums declined to display the fossils. Research funding dried up. Conferences denied exhibition space. Eventually, the specimens found their way into private collections, locked away and out of reach. And then came the letters. Leaked correspondence between major universities revealed a coordinated effort to suppress the Monte Hermoso fossils. The goal wasn't to refute the evidence, it was to contain it, to preserve the linear narrative of human evolution, a narrative where intelligence rises slowly, incrementally, always progressing in one direction. But what if the truth isn't linear? Modern DNA analysis of preserved tissue samples from the fossils has shown a genetic match of 99.7% to today's humans. These weren't proto-humans. They were us, millions of years ago. The question isn't whether the remains are real. The question is why we can't talk about them. Across generations, students have been taught a version of human history that excludes the anomalous, the unexplainable, the inconvenient. But these remains speak volumes. They suggest a past we've forgotten, or perhaps one we were never meant to remember. It's not a question of belief. It's a question of curiosity, of humility in the face of the unknown. Did humans exist millions of years ago? Did we rise, fall, and rise again? And if so, what did we leave behind? The Monte Hermoso humans whisper to us across time. They challenge us not with fear, but with a haunting possibility, that we are far older than we know, and that we've been here before. As we continue our journey, the next chapter takes us deep into the jungles of Central America, where legends speak of skulls made not of bone, but of crystal, and of the knowledge they may still carry. In the dense jungles of Central America, where ruins whisper the stories of long-lost empires, a glint of quartz once changed everything. Between 1924 and 1927, British explorer Frederick Mitchell Hedges uncovered what would become one of the most enigmatic artifacts in modern archaeology, the crystal skull. But this was no tourist trinket. Carved from a single block of clear quartz, the skull was flawless, no tool marks, no imperfections. No, even the jaw was a separate, movable piece, perfectly contoured to fit within the skull's structure. It was, by all accounts, anatomically exact and impossibly advanced. At first, there was excitement, then silence. The skulls, eventually counted at 13, began to vanish into museum vaults, private collections, and government archives. Why? Because the deeper researchers looked, the stranger they became. Under specific lighting, they projected holographic images, star charts, ancient formulas, symbols no one could decode. Some said the skulls emitted subtle sounds or pulses of energy when touched. Others noted a strange influence on nearby electronics, as if the quartz retained some electromagnetic memory. In 1970, Hewlett-Packard Laboratories conducted tests on one of the skulls. Their conclusion? It couldn't have been made with modern technology. Not even diamond-tipped drills could recreate the smooth surfaces without leaving scratches. The crystal's internal lattice should have shattered under conventional carving techniques. But it hadn't. The skulls weren't just decorative. They were functional. Piezoelectric analysis revealed that when subjected to pressure or temperature changes, they emitted electrical fields, fields patterned with mathematical constants not discovered until the 20th century. Some even theorized they could be information storage devices, ancient hard drives encoded not with language, but with energy. When researchers attempted to film these phenomena, something always went wrong. Cameras failed, footage blurred, equipment disappeared. Then came the lockdown. Museums pulled them from displays. Institutions refused to talk. A Smithsonian internal memo described the skulls as containing destabilizing properties. Not dangerous, but disruptive. Their existence contradicted the accepted view of ancient peoples as primitive, superstitious builders with limited tools and tribal knowledge. But what if they weren't primitive? What if they were custodians of knowledge? Some believed the skulls were scattered for a reason, that together they formed a larger device, one that, when activated, would share information from a time before time. A forgotten epoch of humanity, or something even older. Theories abound, but the real story is this. The crystal skulls exist. They've been studied, tested, documented, and then they've been hidden. What they represent is more than an artifact. They are a challenge to the story we've told ourselves about the past. Because if the skulls are real, and the evidence says they are, then someone, thousands of years ago, understood energy, geometry, and information storage at a level we still haven't reached. That changes everything. Maybe the skulls weren't warnings. Maybe they were messages. And maybe, just maybe, we're finally ready to hear them. Next, we follow the current toward a buried power grid in ancient Baghdad that suggests electricity wasn't invented, but rediscovered. In the parched earth beneath ancient Baghdad, something extraordinary was once uncovered, something that pulsed not with myth, but with electricity. In 1936, German archaeologist Wilhelm König discovered a set of curious objects while excavating near the ruins of a Parthian-era village. They would come to be known as the Baghdad batteries, ceramic jars containing copper cylinders and iron rods. When filled with acidic liquid, they produced a measurable electric charge. At first, these ancient devices seemed like a fascinating historical footnote, perhaps used for electroplating. But Koenig's further investigations revealed something far more elaborate, an entire buried network. What he found wasn't a handful of batteries. It was the skeleton of an electrical grid. Beneath layers of history, he uncovered copper cables, ceramic insulators, and junction boxes arranged in patterns eerily similar to modern infrastructure. The components spanned beneath a wide area of the ancient city. They weren't isolated curiosities. They were part of a system built to conduct and distribute power. The artifacts were tested. The copper showed signs of prolonged electrical conductivity. The ceramic insulators were expertly crafted. The junction boxes contained advanced switches made from metal alloys that showed no corrosion after 2 millennia. Engineers who examined the materials were baffled. The sophistication rivaled, and in some cases surpassed, early 20th century technology. And then, just as quickly as the discovery came to light, it vanished. Koenig's excavation permits were canceled. His documentation and photographs were seized by authorities. The site was sealed with concrete. Officially, the batteries were declared an archaeological curiosity, their true purpose dismissed. But private correspondence painted a different picture. British engineer R.A. Ford independently examined Koenig's samples. His conclusion was unequivocal. This was no isolated invention. It was a fully functional electrical system built by a civilization that understood principles of electromagnetism centuries, perhaps millennia, before such knowledge entered our textbooks. So who built it? No one knows. The Parthians were capable, but there is no record of them constructing anything like this. The source of the electricity remains a mystery. Some geological surveys noted magnetic anomalies beneath the site, suggesting the presence of hidden metallic structures, massive ones. But those areas were quickly declared off-limits. Artifacts once sent to museums have since disappeared. No catalog numbers, no transfer records, just blank spaces where history should have been preserved. The implications are profound. If electricity was being used thousands of years ago, not for symbolic rituals, but for practical, citywide purposes, then the timeline of technological development collapses. The idea of a slow linear march from fire to steam to light bulbs no longer holds. Instead, it suggests a cycle, a rise, a fall, a forgetting. The ancient engineers who built Baghdad's grid weren't anomalies. They were part of something bigger, something now buried under concrete and silence. We often think of electricity as a product of the modern age, but maybe it's a rediscovery. Maybe we're not the first to learn how to harness energy from the world around us. And maybe, if we look closely enough, the Earth still remembers. The next chapter leads us to the American heartland, where towering skeletons once hinted at a race of giants, until they were taken away and never seen again. In the soft soil of the American Midwest, beneath fields now planted with corn and soy, something extraordinary was once unearthed and just as quickly buried again. Between the late 1800s and early 20th century, archaeologists and farmers alike began discovering skeletons unlike any ever documented. They measured 7, 8, even 12 feet in height. And they weren't isolated finds. These weren't the remains of a few genetic anomalies. They were entire burial sites. Graveyards filled with giant skeletons, often interred in elaborate tombs, surrounded by artifacts suggesting a complex and advanced culture. Doorways shaped for people twice the size of the average settler. Tools that required immense strength to wield. Jewelry, weapons, even stone tablets, all scaled for beings of extraordinary stature. Local newspapers documented these discoveries in real time. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune. The headlines were clear, the details consistent. Something incredible had been found. But then the pattern changed. Teams from the Smithsonian Institution arrived quickly. They took possession of the remains, promised further study, and then silence. Publicly, they called the skeletons abnormalities, deformities, the result of misinterpretation. Privately, internal memos suggested something else, a directive to preserve the dominant narrative of human evolution. A narrative that didn't include giants. One name stands out, Dr. Alice Hrdlicka, curator of physical anthropology at the Smithsonian. He personally oversaw the collection and removal of many of the giant skeletons. His official reports downplayed or outright denied their significance. But letters obtained later show a different intent, to remove the remains from public view and keep them out of academic circulation. Thousands of skeletons, 17,000 by some internal records, were said to be stored in Smithsonian warehouses during that era. Yet today, officials deny any such inventory exists. Requests for access are denied. Freedom of Information Act petitions are redacted or ignored. And when modern excavations uncover similar remains, they're swiftly classified under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, immediately reburied, untouched, and unavailable for study. This isn't about myths of Nephilim or folklore run wild. This is about documented evidence, bones measured, cataloged, and photographed by professionals, then systematically removed from history. Medical examinations at the time found no signs of disease or pituitary disorder. These were not victims of gigantism. These were healthy, anatomically consistent beings. A branch of humanity, perhaps a lost lineage that once thrived on this continent. The question is not just who they were, but why they've been forgotten. Could these giants have been remnants of an earlier civilization, now erased? Did they build, farm, govern? What did they leave behind? And why does their existence remain one of archaeology's most tightly controlled secrets? Maybe the silence isn't accidental. Maybe the presence of giants unsettles more than just our understanding of biology. Maybe it forces us to reconsider the scope of human diversity and the stories we've chosen to preserve. Sometimes the ground gives up more than bones. It reveals the boundaries of belief. In our next chapter, we head to the Chilean desert, where carved stones speak a language of science centuries ahead of its time, and ask whether knowledge too can be buried. In one of the driest places on Earth, where the sky stretches endlessly and the sun leaves no place to hide, something astonishing was found. Not buried deep, but lying exposed to the wind and time. In 1961, American archaeologist Charles Berlitz stood in the Atacama Desert of Chile, staring down at a collection of stones carved with precision, intent, and knowledge, far beyond what anyone expected. The stones were not decorative. They were not religious. They were technical. Each one bore inscriptions, mathematical formulas, diagrams of atoms, star charts, and symbols that mapped not myth but science. Real science. Equations that described quantum mechanics, relativity, and subatomic structures. Some of the symbols hadn't even been discovered by modern physicists yet. Others mirrored those only recently understood. Over 2,000 of these stones were documented by Berlitz. Each was part of a larger system, a puzzle that, if solved, could unlock knowledge thought exclusive to the modern era. It was as though a lost civilization had been trying to teach, to transmit something vital through time. Independent analysis came from physicists at MIT. They were stunned. The formulas weren't just accurate, they displayed insights into theoretical physics that even contemporary scientists struggled to grasp. Not only were the diagrams precise, they suggested practical applications: energy generation, propulsion systems, communication devices. This wasn't speculative. It was engineering. Then, as with so many other discoveries, the door slammed shut. Chilean authorities seized the stones. Berlitz was stopped at the airport. His research notes were confiscated. He was banned from the country and required to sign documents agreeing not to disclose what he'd found. The official reason? Cultural protection. But leaked documents suggested otherwise. Behind the scenes, government scientists and intelligence agencies had reviewed the data. Their concern wasn't about exploitation, it was about control. Because if the public knew these stones were real, if they understood what they contained, it would disrupt not just archaeology, but science itself. Satellite imagery later revealed that the site had been altered. Military installations now stood where the stones once lay. The region was declared off-limits to all researchers. Those who tried to return found the area patrolled, guarded, monitored. And the stones? Vanished. We live in an age where the lines between science and story are supposed to be clear. But what happens when the story is written in stone and the science comes from a time long before our own? The Atacama stones challenge the idea of linear progress. They suggest that knowledge isn't just built, but sometimes lost. that perhaps humanity has reached the heights of understanding before, only to fall, forget, and start again. Were these stones warnings, lessons, or relics of a civilization that saw the stars not as myths, but as data? If so, then the past is not behind us. It's waiting. And if we choose to look beyond the accepted timeline, beyond the curated history, we may discover that we're not the first to reach for the future. In the next chapter, we descend underground into the hidden chambers of Ecuador, where a forbidden library may hold the entire story of humanity, written not in ink, but in indestructible metal. Deep within the Ecuadorian highlands lies a system of caves known as the Tayos. For generations, they were whispered about in local legends, stories of metal books, glowing walls, and ancient knowledge. In 1976, Scottish explorer Stan Hall led an expedition into those caves, not expecting folklore. What he found, or claimed to find, was something far more incredible. A library built not with stone or clay, but with pages of gold and silver. It was unlike anything seen before. Thousands of metallic books, their pages etched with symbols, diagrams, and languages both known and unknown. Some pages were paper-thin, flexible, yet resistant to wear. Others were more like tablets, durable, unbending, engraved with the precision of a printing press. No visible tool marks, no signs of deterioration. It was as if time had no effect inside those chambers. The content was staggering. Some books chronicled forgotten civilizations, names and places that don't appear in any known history. Others described scientific principles with unsettling accuracy. Astronomical alignments, subatomic theory, energy systems still not understood today. There were star maps, hundreds of them, tracing not just our solar system, but constellations visible only from different hemispheres and even from planetary vantage points we don't currently occupy. And then there were the prophecies. Some volumes described future events, technological shifts, global conflicts, political upheaval. Many of them, Hall claimed, had already come to pass in the decades since his discovery. He documented everything, or tried to, but photographs failed. Cameras shorted out. The books couldn't be clearly captured. The metallic pages interfered with electronics, leaving blurred images and distorted recordings. Still, Hall attempted to bring samples out for testing. That's when the shutdown began. The Ecuadorian military sealed the caves. The area was declared a restricted zone. Hall's research permits were revoked. He was told the caves contained culturally sensitive material and that all further exploration was prohibited. But the truth ran deeper. Leaked communications between Ecuadorian and British officials revealed intense concern. The contents of the library, they feared, could destabilize global historical and scientific paradigms. Agreements were signed. The cave entrance was blocked with concrete. Surveillance systems were installed. Armed guards ensured no one came near. Hall was silenced, not forcibly, but effectively. His findings were dismissed as fantasy. He was cast as a fringe theorist. But his notes remained. His team's testimonies were consistent. And over the years, whispers from insiders confirmed that the metal books were real. Why would someone create a library in metal? To preserve knowledge, to survive fire, flood, war, even time itself. Who built it? No one knows. The languages inscribed within don't match anything in our records. Linguists from Oxford and elsewhere attempted analysis and found structure, grammar, syntax, logic. These weren't random marks. They were part of a designed system, more advanced perhaps than any ancient script ever studied. The idea of a hidden library that predates civilization itself isn't just poetic, it's existential. If such knowledge exists, and we've hidden it, then what else have we chosen to forget? And more hauntingly, why? As we continue this journey, our next stop takes us from underground libraries to ancient observatories, where mechanical computers tracked the skies long before the first telescope was even imagined. In the vast, arid stretches of the Gobi Desert, where wind sweeps endlessly across rust-red sands, a team of Soviet archaeologists stumbled upon something remarkable in 1953, something that should have changed how we understand the evolution of science and technology. But instead, it was buried under a different kind of sand: secrecy. While excavating an ancient site deep within the desert, researchers led by Dr. Yuri Petrov uncovered the remains of a sprawling complex. It wasn't a temple, it wasn't a palace, it was an observatory. Not just a place for watching the stars, but a facility for calculating their movements with astonishing precision. Inside, the team discovered mechanical devices, gear-driven computers, bronze instruments, and calibrated tools that resembled astrolabes, orreries, and calculators. But these were not Renaissance relics. They predated the telescope by over 1,000 years. And they were more accurate than anything their era, or any ancient era, should have been capable of creating. There was one device in particular, a mechanical computer. Constructed of interlocking gears, fine ratios, and precise settings, it could predict planetary positions, eclipses, and celestial cycles with mathematical accuracy rivaling modern software. Soviet engineers who later analyzed the mechanisms found evidence of logarithmic and trigonometric functions encoded into its operation. And then the silence began. Before Dr. Petrov could publish his findings in international journals, Soviet authorities stepped in. The site was classified. The instruments were removed and stored in undisclosed locations. Petrov himself was reassigned, no longer an archaeologist but a functionary, removed from his own discovery. Official records now make no mention of the observatory. But images leaked decades later tell a different story. Blueprints, gear schematics, and field notes confirmed what the archaeologists found. A fully operational computational astronomy center built centuries, if not millennia, before its time. The implications were staggering. If ancient civilizations were building analog computers capable of complex astronomical prediction, then they possessed not only the mechanical expertise, but the theoretical mathematical framework to do so. The kind of knowledge we attribute to Newton, Kepler, or Copernicus may have existed in forgotten hands long before Europe emerged from the Dark Ages. Why the secrecy? Some say the Cold War atmosphere turned every discovery into a potential weapon. Others believe the Soviets feared how Western academia might react, or how such knowledge might erode the dominant narrative of scientific progress. Because discoveries like these don't just rewrite history books, they reshape our understanding of the human mind. It's easy to believe that knowledge accumulates slowly, over time, but the observatory in the Gobi tells a different story. That knowledge can leap, surge, and vanish. That science doesn't always build upward. Sometimes it collapses. And sometimes it is deliberately buried. Today, the original site is unrecognizable. Satellite imagery shows modern structures where the instruments once lay. Access is restricted. No public record acknowledges the excavation. And Dr. Petrov? He died in obscurity, his greatest discovery erased from both his resume and the official annals of Soviet archaeology. But the stars he once studied continue to shine. They remind us that there are those who looked up long before we did and understood far more than we've allowed ourselves to remember. Next, we return to Egypt, not to its monuments above ground, but to what lies beneath the most famous of them all, the Great Pyramid, and the machines that may still be running under the stone. Beneath the blazing Egyptian sun, the Great Pyramid of Giza towers with ageless authority. Tourists marvel at its precision, its mystery, its sheer scale. But what they don't see, what few even know to ask, is what lies beneath. Between 1935 and 1942, French archaeologist Émile Barre embarked on an ambitious excavation beneath the pyramid. What he found was not another burial chamber. It was something else entirely. A complex. Spanning vast underground corridors and sealed rooms, the network was filled not with sarcophagi or treasure, but with machinery. Ancient devices forged from unknown alloys, still gleaming, still intact. Some appeared hydraulic, others electromagnetic. Still others buzzed faintly, as if resisting time itself. Hieroglyphic inscriptions lined the walls, unlike any seen elsewhere in Egypt. They spoke of energy, resonance, and cosmic balance. They described equations, force measurements, and diagrams that seem more at home in a physics textbook than a tomb. Barr documented everything. He was meticulous. And then, everything stopped. Egyptian authorities intervened. His excavation permits were revoked. The entrances to the subterranean chambers were sealed with reinforced concrete. Equipment was confiscated. And Barr, silenced, prohibited from publishing or even discussing his findings with colleagues, but not before his notes were copied. British engineer Robert Bauval later analyzed Barr's records. His conclusion was unequivocal. The underground chambers housed systems that could generate and manipulate energy using principles not formally understood until the modern age. Electromagnetic induction, harmonic resonance, even what appeared to be primitive superconductors. One chamber, described in detail, contained what looked like a power source. It still emitted measurable electric fields, stable, low-frequency pulses, undetectable to the casual observer but unmistakable to scientific instruments. Who built it? The Egyptians certainly claimed the site, but the technology suggested knowledge from a different world or a different time, perhaps pre-dynastic, perhaps much, much older. In response to inquiries, Egyptian officials cited concerns about damaging the structural integrity of the pyramid. But leaked internal memos revealed another motive: fear. Not fear of collapse, fear of revelation. Because to admit what was down there would force a total reevaluation of human technological history. The pyramid has always been a symbol of mystery. But maybe it's also a machine. Not metaphorically, but literally. A device, a generator, a resonator. Something designed not for death, but for power. And if that's true, then the builders were not simply architects. They were engineers, scientists. People who understood energy on a level we're only beginning to rediscover. Today, those underground passages remain sealed. Ground-penetrating radar confirms the chambers are still there. Instruments still detect faint electrical signals. Something down there continues to hum. And yet we turn our eyes away. We speak of pharaohs and tombs, of mummies and myths, but not of machines. Because the truth, that human civilization may have once wielded knowledge far beyond what we credit, is simply too vast to fit into the version of history we've chosen. In our next chapter, we shift our gaze to the Amazon, where an entire network of cities, scientifically advanced, socially evolved, once flourished in silence, only to be erased beneath the canopy of trees and the silence of denial. The Amazon rainforest is a living labyrinth, dense, humid, and teeming with secrets. For centuries it was thought to be untamed, uninhabited, even hostile to civilization. But in 1967, American archaeologist Dr. Richard Thompson began uncovering signs of something very different: a thriving network of advanced civilizations hidden beneath the canopy. What he found defied every expectation. Using aerial photography, satellite imagery, and on-the-ground exploration, Thompson and his team identified massive geometric earthworks, roadways stretching for miles, and the remnants of cities that had once supported tens of thousands. These weren't tribal villages. They were urban centers, organized, sophisticated, and sustainable. At their heart was science. Thompson discovered evidence of advanced agricultural systems, raised fields, intricate irrigation channels, and soil engineering techniques that created what locals call terra preta, black earth, rich and fertile, still in use today. These ancient scientists had modified the soil with charcoal and organic compounds, creating a renewable farming system that modern agronomy still struggles to replicate. But it went further. Artifacts revealed metallurgy centuries ahead of its time: copper tools, surgical instruments, and alloys resistant to corrosion. Mathematical artifacts pointed to knowledge of zero, infinity, and geometric constants. Some structures aligned precisely with celestial events, suggesting a deep understanding of astronomy. Even more stunning were the social systems. Thompson uncovered signs of egalitarian governance, decentralized political systems, civic planning, and infrastructure, suggesting cooperation over hierarchy. Some regions showed early evidence of democratic practices, communal ownership, and social welfare structures. The Amazon, it turned out, was not a place untouched by civilization. It had once been a cradle of it. But the response was swift and final. Academic institutions downplayed Thompson's discoveries. Funding disappeared. Conferences withdrew invitations. And when he tried to publish his findings, major journals rejected them outright. The consensus held firm. The Amazon was too hostile, too primitive to support complexity. Behind closed doors, however, government agencies were watching. Deforestation, resource extraction, and land claims were underway. Acknowledging advanced indigenous civilizations would complicate these efforts. If the Amazon was once home to thriving, knowledgeable societies, then current development wasn't progress. It was erasure. Thompson's notes were classified. His permits revoked. He was barred from returning. In the decades since, the jungle has reclaimed what it once sheltered. Roads have been overgrown, earthworks lost, entire cities erased, not by time, but by deliberate choice. Satellite images still hint at what lies beneath. Rectangular patterns, unnatural clearings, geoglyphs and causeways too precise to be accidental, but boots on the ground rarely follow. The narrative remains. The rainforest is untouched, primitive, empty. But what if it isn't? What if it remembers? What if the Amazon once nurtured a civilization that understood not only how to live with nature, but how to build upon it without destroying it? And what if that knowledge, like so many other things we've buried, was seen not as valuable, but as inconvenient? As we continue, our next chapter brings us back to North America, where the bones of giants weren't the only thing removed from history. Here we revisit evidence of civilization cycles, of rise, of ruin, and of the deliberate forgetting that follows. History often tells us that North America before European contact was a land of scattered tribes and simple settlements. But beneath the quiet hills and winding rivers of this continent lies evidence of something far older and far more advanced than most would ever expect. In mound complexes from Ohio to Louisiana, in caves along the Mississippi, and in the forgotten layers beneath modern cities, archaeologists have uncovered artifacts that suggest the presence of a highly developed civilization. Sophisticated metallurgy, urban planning, astronomical alignments. And yet, each time these discoveries surface, they seem to vanish almost as quickly. What connects them is not just their age or sophistication, but the silence that follows. One such story centers around a site once excavated in the early 20th century near St. Louis. Beneath layers of earth, researchers uncovered large-scale architectural foundations, stone structures aligned to solstices, engraved tablets showing mathematical sequences, and ceramics with symbolic patterns resembling both Mayan and Mediterranean design. The findings were briefly celebrated. Then they were removed, the site was paved over, the records sealed. Today, a parking lot covers what may have been one of the oldest cities in North America. Why? Because these discoveries don't fit. They complicate the accepted story of isolated, undeveloped societies. They suggest trade routes, cultural exchanges, and scientific understanding that extend far beyond what's considered possible. Perhaps most curiously, there are consistent references in oral histories and early settler journals to cyclical floods, cataclysmic events that reshaped the land and erased entire cultures. Could this ancient North American civilization have been wiped out by such a disaster? And more importantly, was knowledge of its existence deliberately forgotten afterward? When researchers attempt to study these sites today, they're often blocked by a wall of legal and institutional barriers. Artifacts are labeled anomalies. Mounds are classified as sacred burial grounds. Excavations are restricted, not to protect the sites, but to preserve the narrative. There's no denying that sacred lands deserve respect. But the refusal to even acknowledge what lies beneath suggests something deeper, something intentional. Because the more we uncover, the clearer the pattern becomes. Civilizations rise, they advance, and then, through natural disaster or human conflict, they fall. What survives is not the people or even the monuments, but the knowledge. And if that knowledge threatens established power structures, it is hidden. The question we must ask is not just what we've lost, but why we've chosen not to remember. North America's ancient civilizations weren't just ancestors of tribal communities. They may have been builders, scientists, and thinkers, connected to a web of global understanding that has been erased not by time, but by choice. As we prepare for the next chapter, we turn toward the Middle East once more, to an artifact long dismissed as a curiosity, but which may in fact reveal something revolutionary. That wireless energy transmission, one of Tesla's greatest dreams, was already realized over 2,000 years ago. In a quiet corner of a Baghdad museum, decades ago, sat a group of unassuming clay jars. They were ancient, certainly, each fitted with a copper cylinder, an iron rod, and traces of acidic residue. To the casual observer, they were little more than curiosities. But to German archaeologist Wilhelm König, who studied them in 1936, they represented something far more profound: electricity. These objects would become known as the Baghdad batteries. When connected with a liquid electrolyte, the jars produced voltage. They worked, simple, direct, and mysterious. But König's research didn't stop there. While exploring nearby excavation sites, he uncovered something else, something that suggested the batteries were not isolated gadgets, but part of an entire electrical infrastructure. Buried beneath the ancient city were signs of an organized power distribution system. Copper wires running in parallel, separated by ceramic insulators. Switch-like mechanisms made from advanced alloys. Junction boxes positioned with precision. The design wasn't random. It followed the logic of a modern grid. And that was impossible. This was the Parthian Empire, centuries before Volta, before Edison, before anyone, as far as mainstream history is concerned, had harnessed electricity. But the evidence said otherwise. Analysis of the copper showed signs of repeated conductivity. The alloys in the switching components were unlike anything recorded in ancient metallurgy. Durable, highly conductive, and suspiciously modern. More intriguingly, magnetic anomalies detected beneath the old city pointed to a possible centralized power source, something still undiscovered, possibly hidden or destroyed. When König tried to map the full extent of the network, his permits were pulled. His notes were seized. The excavation site was sealed, poured over with concrete. His findings were dismissed, and official archaeology moved on. Yet fragments of the truth remained. British electrical engineer R.A. Ford reviewed König's samples and confirmed their functionality. In fact, he suggested the ancient system might have been more efficient than many contemporary grids. Even more startling were indications that some form of wireless energy transmission may have been in use, a concept Nikola Tesla explored but never fully realized. Could ancient engineers have solved it long ago? There are no definitive answers, only patterns, artifacts that work, components that fit. A network that looks like power, sounds like power, and may well have been power, 2,000 years ahead of its time. So why doesn't history acknowledge it? Because to do so would force a re-examination of everything, of how technology develops, of what ancient people were capable of, and of whether progress is always linear, or whether perhaps some knowledge was discovered, mastered, and then lost, or worse, buried. Today the Baghdad batteries are back in storage. The wires are gone. The switches have disappeared. Requests to revisit the sites are denied. And the suggestion that ancient Iraq may have once lit its cities with clean, wireless energy is treated as myth. But maybe it wasn't a myth. Maybe it was memory. And maybe our future was once our past. In the next chapter, we return to Central America, to a discovery made not of machines or tools, but of a design so impossibly intricate and out of time, it raises a deeper question. Who were we before we forgot? In the deep jungles and highlands of Central America, beyond the reach of modern roads, lie stone cities carved with a precision that still confounds archaeologists. But among all the temples and pyramids of the Maya and Aztec, one story stands apart, tied not to buildings, but to objects. Objects of such craftsmanship and complexity that they seem less like relics and more like messages. Between 1924 and 1927, British explorer Frederick Mitchell Hedges reportedly discovered a set of crystal skulls hidden within ruins across Central America. These weren't crude souvenirs. They were anatomically precise, carved from solid quartz, with detachable jaws and internal details that mimic the exact proportions of the human skull. But that wasn't the strange part. Under certain conditions, light, vibration, even touch, these skulls seemed to activate. Witnesses described holographic projections, stars, symbols, and complex mathematical imagery. Some heard tones or felt electromagnetic pulses. Others noticed that electronic devices nearby flickered or failed. Was it real or just imagination? In 1970, Hewlett-Packard Laboratories conducted a thorough analysis of one skull. Their conclusion was simple. It couldn't have been made using any known modern technology. No tool marks, no cracks. The internal structure of the quartz should have shattered if it had been carved with any rotary device. It hadn't. So how were they made? That question has never been answered. The skulls soon vanished from public display. Museums retracted their exhibits. Some artifacts disappeared entirely. Researchers trying to document their properties faced strange interference. Equipment would malfunction, recordings would distort. And behind closed doors, government agencies stepped in. Leaked Smithsonian records described the skulls as potentially dangerous, not because they posed a threat, but because they raised too many questions. What civilization created them? How did they possess the knowledge of human anatomy, crystal acoustics, and energy manipulation? And what was their purpose? Some believed the skulls were data storage, early computers of a kind we don't yet understand. Others theorized they were ceremonial devices designed to connect with forces beyond physical space. A few suggested they were part of a larger system, 13 skulls, each tuned to a frequency meant to be arranged in a specific geometric formation. That idea gained traction when independent laboratories discovered that, when placed in certain patterns, the skulls generated weak electromagnetic fields. These fields interfered with nearby electronics and produced audible frequencies that resembled coded signals. But as more attention gathered, the doors closed. Access was revoked. Artifacts moved into private or classified collections. Academics who tried to pursue the story found their funding cut or their reputations questioned. The official narrative returned. The skulls were hoaxes, tourist fakes, or misinterpreted relics. And yet the carvings remain. Today, a few skulls are still visible to the public behind glass. But the ones reported to project images or emit signals are gone. Their whereabouts unknown. Their secrets, if ever unlocked, lost again to time. What if they weren't designed to do something, What if they were designed to remind us of something? That knowledge isn't always stored in books or circuits. Sometimes it's carved in silence, waiting to be read by those who still remember how to see. In our final chapter, we return to the beginning, to the question that threads through every discovery. What kind of civilization forgets itself, and why do we fear the memory? Every buried artifact, every sealed vault and forgotten manuscript leads us to the same quiet place. A question, not shouted, but whispered through the ages. Why do we forget? The journey we've taken from the sands of Egypt to the jungles of the Amazon, from the halls of underground libraries to the gears of ancient computers, paints a picture not of isolated anomalies, but of a pattern, a rhythm of brilliance and erasure, knowledge rising, civilizations thriving, only to fall silent again. It begs the question, what kind of species discovers the stars, learns to shape metals and harness energy, then forgets it all? The answer perhaps lies not in conspiracy, but in cycles. We want to believe in a straight line of progress, that our ancestors were simpler, less capable, and that we are the apex of civilization. But what if that's not true? What if history moves like a tide, advancing, receding, and returning in waves we no longer recognize? Maybe ancient knowledge wasn't lost. Maybe it was locked away, because it frightened those who held it, or because it wasn't meant for that moment in time. Maybe some of it was buried by disaster and some by design. Maybe we've inherited a world of ruins, not just of stone, but of memory. And maybe that's the true legacy of humanity, not only our capacity to create, but our tendency to forget what we've already made. Throughout this exploration, we've seen evidence: radar scans beneath the Sphinx, fossilized humans out of time, technologies beyond their eras, and civilizations whose knowledge dwarfed their modern conquerors. Each story, on its own, might be dismissed, but together they reveal something unmistakable. Our past is deeper than we've been told, so why suppress it? Because truth, when it contradicts power, becomes dangerous, not because of what it reveals, but because of what it demands. If ancient peoples harnessed energy, mastered mathematics, or built sustainable societies we can't yet replicate, what does that say about us? About our assumptions, our pride, our trajectory. Maybe the stories were buried to protect institutions. Or maybe they were buried to protect us from the weight of knowing we've done this all before. What would we do if we truly believed that civilizations had risen and fallen not once but many times? Would we change our course? Would we listen to the past not just as myth but as memory? Maybe this is why these discoveries still matter. Not for the spectacle, not for the controversy, but because they remind us that progress isn't guaranteed, that knowledge must be cared for, that history is fragile, and that forgetting comes at a cost. So we stand now not at the end of the story, but at the edge of a new question. What else lies hidden beneath our feet, beyond our textbooks, outside the limits of sanctioned memory? And more urgently, when we find it again, will we choose to remember? The past has not vanished. It waits, silent, powerful, and patient. It waits for those willing to see beyond the curated chapters, for those who understand that to remember is not only an act of discovery, but of responsibility. Because the truth isn't buried. We are.